Hello, class. My name is Kyle Vincent, and today I'm joined by Chance Wedderburn and Chris Kennedy to introduce you to the topic of ethics expectations. Historically, the general expectation for businesses has been that businesses exist to serve the needs of both the shareholders and society. Stakeholders place trust in any given company, and if their expectations are not met, then consequences typically occur at the expense of the shareholders, officers, and directors. So what defines a corporation's culture and ethics? Most would probably say their corporate governance or their tone at the top, but this isn't always true, as we will discuss in just a little bit. A corporation's respect for their stakeholders is really what usually determines a corporation's success and ethical values. This respect doesn't just derive from corporate governance, it also derives from professional accountants being aware of the public expectations and managing of the business's risks appropriately. There are many factors that affect public expectations for business behavior. These include unbridled greed, physical, moral, bad judgments, activist stakeholders, environmental reality, economic, competition, financial malfeasance, governance failures, accountability, synergy, and institutional reinforcement. One of the biggest influencers for the early public opinion about good corporate behavior was the realization that the public's physical well-being and the well-being of workers was being threatened by corporate activity. As you probably already know, environmental issues such as air pollution, smoke, asbestos, acid rain, the dissipation of the ozone layer, and CFCs are some of the biggest items at the forefront of this environmental debate. Most companies initially said that they did not have any technological solutions to treat these threats. However, once the public health issues were discovered, companies and governments began to feel pressured to improve safety standards. To help appease public opinion, governments have reacted by implementing regulations such as non-smoking areas regionally. Internationally, fines are put into place for corporate convicted environmental malfeasance, and organizations such as the Global Reporting Initiative's G4 guidelines requires companies to report publicly on their environmental impacts. On the cultural and moral standpoint, over the past 30 years, there has been an increased sensitivity to the lack of fairness normally afforded to certain individuals and groups in society. This sensitivity has brought about regulations in areas such as employment, where pay equality and non-discriminatory hiring practice are required by the government. All of this being said, directors, executives, and managers are human and they make mistakes. Governmental regulations can't always prevent corporations from behaving without the public interest in mind. The old saying goes, just because it's legal doesn't make it right. Many corporations have fallen to this ideal. Nestle was boycotted to stop the distribution of free baby formula to unneeding mothers in Africa. For those of you who don't know, Nestle was discovered to be distributing free baby formula to African mothers who didn't need it. In turn, the babies would become addicted to the formula, and the mothers would be forced to purchase the formula and mix it with often tainted water. Were these actions illegal? No. Unethical? Certainly most anyone would say yes. Then there are corporations such as Volkswagen who intentionally break the law and cheat on their emissions tests in order to save money. Recently, what some would call ethical investors stopped purchasing mutual funds of companies that were involved in such unethical activities in an effort to hurt their bottom line and make a statement, ultimately in hopes of pushing these companies out of business. Obviously, corporate scandals don't always take place on the environmental standpoint. Financial fiascos are typically the most prominent leader of all of corporate scandals. The repetitiveness of financial wrongdoings has led to an expectations gap with the public. This gap is known as the difference between what the public thinks it's getting in audited financial statements and what it is actually getting. To put it in layman's terms, the user of the financials believe the information in audited financials are right, but the auditor may have missed something. Like I said before, we are all human and we all make mistakes. This lack of confidence in the financial statements has led to the credibility gap, in which users of financial statements don't always trust the auditors or corporations. In reaction to the credibility and expectations gaps, after some of the biggest financial scandals in history, Enron and WorldCom, in 2002 the US Congress and Senate passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, in an effort to restore the public's lost confidence in business. I said we would come back to it, and now we have. I previously mentioned how corporate governance was not always sufficient enough to protect the investors and public interest. Well, to quote the U.S. Senate on the Enron scandal, the Enron board of directors failed to safeguard Enron shareholders and contributed to the collapse of the seventh largest public company in the United States. The board witnessed numerous indications of questionable practices by Enron management over several years, but chose to ignore them to the detriment of the Enron shareholders, employees, and business associates. For this very reason, government reform was considered necessary to protect the public interest, and thus the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was created. The lack of trust in corporations called for increased transparency, and corporations have responded by engaging in actions such as posting their CSR or corporate social responsibility on their websites. There are few days where we don't hear about a new financial scandal, and the result of this is a heightened awareness for the need for controls on unethical corporate behavior. The public's increased awareness pressures politicians who then place laws into action, which results in institutional reinforcement by corporations. Even internationally, governments are taking steps in order to prevent the future financial scandals from arising. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development signed the Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions to enact anti-bribery legislation, which is similar to the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The desire for global regulation ultimately led to the International Accounting Standards Board and the International Federation of Accountants. These regulations help to unify international business into a set standard that is accepted and understood by shareholders globally. Now I will pass it over to my colleague, Chance Wedderburn, who will be discussing new expectations for business and responses and developments to those new expectations.
Hey everyone, this is Chance, and I'm starting here with the new expectations for business. The change from a profit-only world has developed and changed in such a way that's described simply as businesses existing to serve society, just as Kyle previously mentioned. Three critical issues the chapter mentions with this change is the deviation from a profit-only focus does not mean that profit falls, yet in fact, profits may typically rise. Often many think that businesses can't afford to be ethical because too many opportunities would be given up for profit, or executives can't afford to divert their attention from profits without them falling. This, however, was proven to be the opposite according to a study by Curtis Versker, who finds that while short-term profits may increase, decreasing is typically what happens when social objectives are not considered by executives. The study does, however, show that social and profit goals can mix profitably. Those focused on simply improving profits make short-term, opportunistic decisions that jeopardize sustainable long-run profit. It's often seen that sustainability is the consequence of high-quality goods and services. The second critical issue that the chapter mentions is profits is now recognized as an incomplete measure of corporate performance. Given the new environment in which we live, many factors such as credibility, reputation, and others are also determinants of success, as long-term profits and sustainability is the shift in focus. Friedman explicitly expected that performance would be within the law and ethical customs. A minimum framework of rules is essential in being effective in providing low-cost working of market while protecting all participants. Regulations are in place and implemented to respond to behavior based on the needs of society and continue to increase until companies and the environment change to improving the ethical governance and behavior within. Governance objectives must direct attention to new perspectives of fiduciary relationship, and modern accountability frameworks should include reports that focus on them. If this isn't done, the public's expectations aren't met, and regulations may be created to ensure focus on strengthening the objectives desired. To provide clarity about objectives a company may have, many have chosen to apply for certification as a benefit or a B Corp, which requires a company to sign a declaration that the company will purposefully create benefits for all stakeholders and aspire to do no harm. The primary fiduciary responsibility of professional accountants should be to the public or to the public's interest. If it's not maintained, the credibility of corporations in the accounting profession will erode, just as shown with the numerous scandals of the early 2000s. These failures have since brought realization that loyalty does not remain just with current investors, rather future, as those that may soon invest also rely on the reporting. Reform of the profession remains underway, and while it began with SOX, the SEC and PCAOB have shifted to the global standards of the International Accounting Standards Board and the International Federation of Accountants. We'll now begin speaking about the responses and development with emerging governance and stakeholder accountability models. Evolution's reactions, moving from a profit-only mandate to one recognizing the interdependence of business and society, became more readily observable as the 1990s progressed. In addition, several other important trends developed, which include the following: expansion of legal liability for corporate directors, the CEO and the CFO, management's assertions to shareholders on the adequacy of controls, as well as a stated intention to manage risk and protect the reputation of the company. This has led to a more ethically demanding environment where businesses began taking a greater interest in activities posing ethical risks. The initial reaction to this was the desire to know how ethical activities of a company have been and then create a code of ethics. Although codes help reduce vulnerability in decision making, many companies have implemented additional early warning systems to help facilitate matters with fast remedial action if problems arise. This also led to companies instilling training on values upon hire, as well as implementing whistleblower hotlines. Companies initially evaluated activities one by one. They did so by evaluating processes and deeming those that were problematic. However, this led to more of a patched-up system and did not offer guidance for employees. This later left vulnerabilities for employees to claim ignorance on not knowing how to properly treat situations. Commitment to these mechanisms grew during the promulgation of U.S. sentencing guidelines for environmental offenses from November 1st, 1992. This led to widespread concern of due diligence. The realization of GE's litigation under the False Claims Act led to a fine of over $70 million from the U.S. sentencing guideline previously mentioned. This has sparked an interest in a governance mechanism to convey appropriately guidance to personnel. To incorporate the interests of stakeholders into the policy, strategies, and operations, management and other employees must first understand the nature of stakeholders' interests. This can be done by surveys, focus groups, and mapping according to stereotypes. Values tend to differ at times from stakeholder interests and company policies. However, progress has been made toward a set of hypernorms. Hypernorms are defined as a value that is most universally respected by stakeholder groups. And these include honesty, compassion, predictability, fairness, integrity, and responsibility. The relevance to these hypernorms is very significant to the future success of corporations and should be built into their ethic codes. Reputation has also been a subject of recent study. Factors seen as important to reputation are closely aligned with the hypernorms previously mentioned. Charles Faunbaum of the Reputation Institute mentions 4 determinants of reputation, which include credibility, trustworthiness, reliability, and responsibility, as shown in the figure attached. Management and auditors have now become increasingly risk management oriented since the mid-90s. Risk is defined as the chance something happens that impacts the objectives of a company. Risk management is the process that is directed toward effective management of potential risk failures and adverse effects. Risk management techniques in the Risk Management Standard, ISO 31000, have since been created. This provides guidance for internal and external programs, and companies can use it to compare risk management practices with an international benchmark that provides principles of effective management and corporate governance. The practices developed are done as parties involved recognize the value in assessing risk and planning to mitigate future detrimental consequences. Auditors have shifted their approach to examine said risks and ensure management is addressing them and accounting for them in their records and financial reports. Given the scandals of the early 2000s mentioned previously, corporations are now mandated to ensure that they have an effective risk management process. Although risk management is in place with many companies, most do not specifically consider the ethics risk, which is the risk of failing to meet shareholder expectations. Ethics risks, however, have been proven important to reputation, as seen with the Volkswagen debacle and investment banks' contribution to the 2008 financial crisis. To ignore ethics risk is to risk similar fates evident in earlier corporate debacles. With the rise of stakeholder interests and accountability, there's a rise in the desire for reports to be relevant to the interests of stakeholders. The desires also include higher accuracy and integrity. As previously, many issues were not covered or they were written without transparency. Accuracy is of course fundamental to an understanding of the underlying facts. The need for improvement in this has motivated the discussion among accountants about the nature of the guidelines they should use for preparation of financial reports.
Hello, my name is Christopher Kennedy. Ethical behavior and developments in business ethics is inherently subjective, as over the centuries, many philosophical theorists have developed concepts to apply a level of understanding. Philosophical approaches to ethical behavior. What makes a decision acceptable or unacceptable has been debated since prehistoric times. To the right are some of the famous Western philosophers, starting with perhaps the most famous, Aristotle. The Greek philosopher Aristotle believed the goal in life was happiness, and is achieved by virtues like integrity, honor, loyalty, courage, and forthrightness. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant, he believed that in order for someone to be ethical, they must not use people opportunistically or in a hypocritical manner, demanding expectations that you wouldn't place on yourself. The English philosopher John Stuart Mill, maximizing happiness is the goal, or minimizing unhappiness or pain for individuals, or the society as a whole. This can be both physical or mental. American philosopher John Rawls believed that society should be structured in a way that is fair distribution of rights and benefits, where any inequalities would also be everyone else's advantage. Studying theories like this should provide a way to help professionals to understand ethical foundation and a basis for conducting business in an ethical manner. Business ethic concepts. The stakeholder concept. Stakeholders encompass many more people than just the actual stakeholders, like employees, customers, suppliers, borrowers, host communities, government, environmentalists, and the media. This takes us to the next concept, which could be social contract, which takes into account not only the ability to produce profits, but the reputation and the effect that it has on society as a whole. A good example of this is child labor laws, which is no longer condoned as it is very unethical. Approaches to ethical decision making. The ethical principles to be discussed provide a key insight for decision makers and professionals alike. To understand these three basic philosophical approaches can be a great benefit. Consequentialism, which requires ethical decisions to have good consequences. Deontology, which holds that an ethical act depends on the rights, duties, and justice involved. Virtue ethics, which considers an act ethical if it demonstrates the virtues expected by the stakeholders of the participants. From these principles, there's three approaches that encompass practical ethical decision making. The first is the modified 5-question approach. This involves challenging any proposed policy with the following scales: profitability, legality, fairness, impact of the rights of each stakeholder along with the environment. And it can be demonstrated with the virtues of the stakeholders. The modified moral standards approach focuses on 4 dimensions of impact of proposed action. Does it provide a benefit to society? Is it fair to all stakeholders? Is it right? Does it reflect the virtues expected by the stakeholders? And lastly, the modified partisan approach, which suggests that any proposed decision be evaluated in comparison to the company's ethics and benefits it produced, whether it requires conflict resolution or whether it abuses the rights of everyone that belong there. The ethical environment for professional accountants. The aftermath of Enron, WorldCom, and Arthur Andersen called for fundamental changes to the role and conduct of professional accountants. Primarily, loyalty should go out to the public interest, not financial gain of any sort to any individual or group. public credibility of the profession was almost destroyed until reforms through new regulations, supervisions, codes of conduct, and standards of disclosure were made. We needed to narrow the expectations gap between the auditors, the users of audits, and the users of financial statements, so that not only accountants were perceived more ethically, but they actually were more ethical. Governance is one of the best ways to accomplish this goal. With GAAP, or Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, and the International Code of Ethics for professional accountants, the future is looking very bright for the accountants coming through. Also, auditors play a very key role, and they must remain independent, objective, and accurate. This has been made very apparent through poor audit quality and highly publicized failures. Managing ethical risk and opportunities. Developing a culture of integrity can be achieved through clear communication, personal commitment by senior management, integration, reinforcement of ethics, and education. Two fundamental ways of managing risk and opportunities are the whistleblower hotline and the ethical leadership. These need to be installed as they're very, very helpful to the business. Corporate governance also plays a key role. With increased expectations from increased regulations and supervision commitments, businesses must depend on people that need to have integrity, as many different cultures and behaviors are at the workplace, making governance a delicate but crucial part of the image and success of a business. Having governance that can identify and cease improper behavior such as sexual abuse, fraud, white-collar crimes, and corporate psychopaths is the goal, as corporate psychopaths is a delicate sense because people really don't have a sense of right or wrong, and it's very, very helpful to be able to identify and manage these kind of risks. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.